The air inside the Harrison Foods processing plant on the industrial fringe of Chicago was perpetually cold, smelling faintly of disinfectant and cardboard. It was a vast, sterile cavern of polished concrete and stainless steel, where the relentless, metallic hum of machinery was the only constant heartbeat. Harsh, fluorescent lights beat down from the high ceilings, bleaching all color from the scene and glinting off the surfaces of the conveyor belts that snaked through the facility. This was a place built for ruthless efficiency, a kingdom of automation where the human workers, clad in identical white uniforms and hairnets, seemed like mere extensions of the equipment they operated. Their movements were repetitive, almost robotic, their faces etched with a fatigue that the stark lighting did nothing to hide. It was a monument to modern productivity, but every corner of it felt devoid of warmth, a place where humanity had been systematically engineered out of the equation. Among them, a man who called himself Alex kept his head down, his hands fumbling with the packaging, his face deliberately unshaven for the past few days, and the simple, worn uniform did their job of masking the fact that he was Caleb Harrison, the company's CEO and sole heir. He was an imposter in his own empire, trying to understand the world his father had built from the ground up. His eyes kept drifting a few feet down the line to Eleanor Miller. At 65, her face was a roadmap of a long, hard life, but her gaze, though tired, held a quiet resilience. Her hands, gnarled and calloused from decades of the same repetitive motion, moved with a practiced, steady rhythm. Hovering nearby was Mr. Fletcher, the line manager, a man whose presence radiated an impatient energy. He stalked the floor with a clipboard, his eyes scanning not the people, but the numbers, his expression a permanent scowl. Suddenly, Fletcher's pacing stopped directly behind Eleanor. A small pile of boxes had accumulated beside her station, her pace having momentarily faltered. "Miller, are we taking a nap?" he barked, his voice cutting through the mechanical drone. The other workers flinched, but kept their eyes fixed on their tasks, a silent, practiced refusal to get involved. Eleanor's shoulders tensed, but she didn't look up. "You're falling behind." Again, Fletcher continued, his tone dripping with condescension. "You're a clog in the system, an obsolete part that's slowing everyone else down." He kicked one of the boxes lightly with the toe of his polished shoe. The sound was small, but it echoed like a gunshot in the tense silence that had fallen over that section of the line. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she reached for another package, her face flushed with a shame she tried desperately to hide. The final blow came when Fletcher leaned in, his voice low enough to be a threat, but loud enough for those nearby, including Caleb, to hear clearly. "Pick up the pace, or you're out," he hissed. "This company isn't a retirement home." Those words struck Caleb with the force of a physical impact. It wasn't just the cruelty of the statement, it was a profound desecration of everything his father had stood for. His father saw these employees as family, the bedrock of his life's work. In that instant, Fletcher wasn't just humiliating a loyal employee, he was spitting on a legacy. Caleb felt a cold, quiet rage build inside him, a pain that was deeply personal. It's in moments like these, seeing such a raw injustice, that you realize some stories just have to be told. If you believe that dignity should never have a price tag, please subscribe to our channel to help us continue sharing them. The silence that followed Fletcher's departure was heavier than the constant hum of the machinery. Caleb, still just Alex to the world, knelt and began gathering the fallen boxes, his movements deliberate and calm. He placed them carefully back on the conveyor, his hands working in tandem with Eleanor's. Their eyes met for only a second, but in that fleeting glance he saw not just shame and fear, but a flicker of surprise and a profound, weary gratitude. He offered a small, reassuring nod, a silent promise that he couldn't yet articulate. For Caleb, this was no longer an undercover experiment or a journey of discovery. It was a rescue mission. He felt the weight of his father's name not as a burden of wealth, but as a mantle of responsibility that had been left to gather dust for far too long. That night, Caleb returned not to his life, but to the hollow shell of it. His penthouse, with its panoramic views of a glittering Chicago skyline, felt more like a cage than a home. The minimalist decor, the polished chrome, the vast, empty spaces. It all mirrored the void he felt inside. He remembered his father coming home from the factory, his hands smelling of cardboard and his face etched with a satisfying exhaustion. Those hands had built this empire, brick by brick, relationship by relationship. Caleb's hands, by contrast, were soft, accustomed only to the smooth surface of a boardroom table or the cool glass of a smartphone. He was an heir to a kingdom he had never walked, a ruler who didn't know his people. The imposter syndrome gnawed at him, a bitter truth in a life built on a legacy he felt he hadn't earned. The next day, during their 15-minute break, Caleb found Eleanor sitting alone in the corner of the bleak break room, nursing a cup of tea in a thermos. He approached cautiously, taking a seat at the adjacent table. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low. She looked up, startled, her eyes studying his face for a moment before she gave a tired, resigned nod. "I've been here a long time, son. I've seen managers like Fletcher come and go." There was no anger in her voice, only a deep, settled weariness, the sound of a spirit that had learned to bend rather than break. She seemed more concerned for him, for the new guy who had dared to stand up for her, than for herself. You knew the founder, didn't you?" Caleb asked, correcting himself just in time. Eleanor's face softened instantly, a genuine warmth spreading across her features for the first time. "Oh, yes, Mr. Harrison. He was a good man, a real gentleman." She looked off into the distance, her mind clearly back in a different era. "He walked this floor every single morning, knew everyone's name, asked about their kids. He once sent my daughter a card when she was sick with the flu. He said we weren't just employees, we were the foundation. This place had a heart back then," she finished, her voice trailing off with a quiet sadness that pierced Caleb's carefully constructed disguise. The narrator would later learn the full weight of her story, a tapestry of resilience woven from threads of sorrow. Eleanor was a widow, having lost her husband to a heart attack over a decade ago. The true heartbreak came 5 years later, when her only daughter, a single mother of 2, succumbed to a swift and aggressive cancer. Suddenly, Eleanor was no longer just a factory worker nearing retirement. She was the sole provider and guardian for her 2 young grandchildren. Every shift she worked, every box she packed, was for them. It was for their school clothes, their meals, their chance at a future her own daughter never got to see. Her quiet dignity wasn't just a personality trait. It was a shield forged in the fires of profound loss and unwavering love. Caleb began to see the factory through new eyes. He noticed the subtle but pervasive signs of neglect that went beyond Fletcher's open cruelty. He saw the flickering lights in the back corridor that no one had bothered to fix, the worn-out safety mats that workers carefully stepped over, the quiet desperation in the eyes of a young man whose request for a day off to see his sick child had been denied. Fletcher was a symptom of a larger disease, a corporate culture that had prioritized efficiency over empathy, reducing human beings to mere numbers on a productivity report. This wasn't just one bad manager. It was a systemic failure, a slow poisoning of the very foundation his father had so carefully built. It is heartbreaking to see how easily a legacy of care can be eroded by indifference. If you've ever felt that a little more humanity could change the world, subscribing helps us share more stories that prove it can. A few days later, in the noisy cafeteria, Caleb sat with Eleanor again. This time, he shared a piece of himself, a carefully edited story about a tough but fair boss he once had, a mentor who taught him the value of hard work. The story was a fabrication, but the sentiment behind it was real, a veiled tribute to his own father. The offering of vulnerability worked. Eleanor opened her wallet and showed him a small, creased photograph of two smiling children. "My grandkids, Jacob and Sarah," she said, her voice swelling with a pride that momentarily erased all the exhaustion from her face. In that moment, she wasn't Eleanor Miller, the slow packer. She was a grandmother, a fighter, a woman holding her entire world together with calloused hands and a boundless heart. That evening, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, Caleb felt a profound shift within him. The city lights below seemed distant and meaningless. He looked at a framed photograph of his father, a man with a kind smile and eyes that held the weight of 1,000 responsibilities. For weeks, he had been an observer, a ghost in his own machine, gathering data. But data couldn't capture the look in Eleanor's eyes or the quiet dignity in her voice. He finally understood that honoring his father wasn't about protecting profit margins. It was about protecting his principles. It's that precise moment of clarity. When purpose becomes undeniable, that changes a person forever. If you believe in the power of one person to make a stand, your subscription gives a voice to these pivotal journeys. His newfound resolve was quickly tested. Fletcher, sensing a quiet rebellion in Alex, began to single him out. He assigned Caleb the most grueling tasks, cleaning out the industrial freezers, hauling heavy pallets from the loading dock, and sorting rejects in a poorly ventilated corner of the plant. The manager would often stand nearby, arms crossed, a smug look on his face, trying to break him. But the intimidation had the opposite effect. Every grueling task, every condescending remark only strengthened Caleb's resolve. He wasn't just fighting for Eleanor anymore. He was fighting for every worker who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, or disposable. The more Fletcher pushed, the more Caleb felt like his father's son. Through it all, Eleanor became his silent ally. She never spoke of Fletcher's harassment, but she would leave a bottle of cold water at Caleb's station on a hot day, or quietly point out a more efficient way to stack the pallets. One afternoon, seeing him struggling, she approached and showed him a specific knot for securing a load, a trick she'd learned decades ago. "Mr. Harrison taught me that one," she said with a small smile. "He said a job done right is a job done safely." It was a simple act of kindness, but for Caleb, it was a lifeline. She was not a victim to be saved. She was a partner in a quiet resistance, a living testament to the company's forgotten soul. That night, Caleb bypassed the company's digital servers and went to the physical archives in the main office building, a dusty room few had entered in years. He pulled Eleanor Miller's employee file. It was a thick manila folder, filled with decades of performance reviews and commendations. On the very first page, on her original hiring form from 40 years ago, was a signature that made his breath catch in his throat. It was his father's, bold and clear, with a handwritten note in the margin. "A dedicated worker with a strong heart. She'll be a great asset to the family." The ink was faded, but the sentiment was as powerful as if it had been written that very day. He closed the file, the last piece of his doubt falling away. The rage he had felt on the factory floor had now cooled into a clear, unshakable purpose. He walked out of the archives, no longer feeling like an imposter. He knew exactly who he was and what he had to do. He pulled out his phone, not to check stock prices or corporate emails, but to make a single call to his executive assistant. His voice was steady, devoid of any hesitation. "Arrange a mandatory all-hands assembly for every employee at the Chicago plant tomorrow at 10 a.m., he commanded, "and cancel everything else on my schedule. Everything." The game was over. It was time for the king to reclaim his kingdom. The next morning, an unnatural quiet had fallen over the Harrison Foods processing plant. The relentless hum of machinery was replaced by the nervous, shuffling sound of hundreds of workers gathering on the main floor. They stood in clusters, their white uniforms a sea of uncertainty, whispering and casting anxious glances toward a makeshift stage built from stacked wooden pallets. Mr. Fletcher stood near the front, arms crossed, an expression of smug impatience on his face, clearly believing this assembly was his own idea to discipline the workforce. Then two figures emerged from the administrative wing. One was Eleanor Miller, her face etched with confusion as she was gently guided forward. The other was the man they knew as Alex, now dressed in a simple but impeccably tailored dark suit, his face clean-shaven, his posture radiating a calm authority that silenced the room instantly. He stepped onto the pallet stage, taking a portable microphone. The low crackle of the speaker was the only sound in the vast space. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady and clear, carrying to every corner of the silent factory. "Most of you know me as Alex. That's not my real name. My name is Caleb Harrison." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, a wave of shock and disbelief. Eyes darted from Caleb to Fletcher, whose smug expression had dissolved into a mask of pale, horrified confusion. Caleb's gaze swept over the faces before him, acknowledging their surprise, but his eyes held no trace of arrogance. He wasn't a boss looking down on his subjects. He was a son who had come home to a house in disarray, ready to set things right. Caleb's gaze then softened as he turned to the woman standing beside him. "But I didn't call you here to talk about me," he said, his voice lowering, becoming more personal, yet every word was amplified for all to hear. "I called you here to apologize to one of our own, Mrs. Eleanor Miller." He looked directly at her, and the entire factory seemed to hold its breath. "Eleanor, on behalf of this company, and on behalf of my father, I'm so deeply sorry. We failed you. We allowed a culture of numbers to replace a culture of people. We forgot that this company was built on respect, and you, who have given 40 years of your life to us, were shown the absolute opposite of that." A single tear traced a path down Eleanor's weathered cheek, a silent testament to a lifetime of quiet dignity finally being seen. Then Caleb straightened up, his eyes finding Mr. Fletcher in the crowd. The quiet authority in his voice was replaced by a blade of steel. "This company's most valuable assets are not its machines or its profit margins. They are its people," he declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "Any manager who fails to understand that has no place here." He pointed a single, steady finger at Fletcher. "Mr. Fletcher, you are fired, effective immediately. Not for failing to meet quotas, but for a complete and total lack of humanity. Security will escort you out." For a moment, there was stunned silence. Then a single worker began to clap. The sound was tentative at first, then it was joined by another and another, until a thunderous, cathartic applause filled the entire plant, a sound of chains breaking. As the applause subsided, Caleb placed a gentle hand on Eleanor's shoulder, a gesture of partnership, not pity. "This is a new day for Harrison Foods," he announced to the hopeful faces watching him. "And to ensure we never lose our way again, I am creating a new position. I am appointing Eleanor Miller as our first ever counselor for employee well-being and legacy. She will be your advocate, your voice, and my constant reminder of what truly matters." He looked out at the sea of workers, his employees, his family. "She will help us rebuild the foundation my father laid. A foundation of dignity, respect, and heart. Welcome back to the Harrison family." In that moment, he was no longer just an heir. He was a leader, and the soul of the company began to stir back to life. The weeks that followed were not filled with grand announcements or press releases, but with quiet, meaningful action. The changes at Harrison Foods began on the factory floor itself. New, ergonomic safety mats appeared, the flickering lights were replaced, and a simple, anonymous suggestion box was installed, with Caleb himself reading every submission each Friday. He reinstated his father's old profit-sharing program, and the first quarterly bonuses, larger than anyone had seen in a decade, were not a corporate strategy, but a shared victory. Eleanor, in her new role, was not confined to an office. She walked the floor daily, her presence a source of comfort and wisdom. She listened to the workers' concerns, mediated disputes with a gentle but firm hand, and became the living compass that guided the company back to its true north, ensuring the humanity Caleb had restored was never again misplaced. Caleb's own transformation was just as profound. He sold the cold, expansive penthouse, trading its sterile silence for a modest home much closer to the community he now served. He established the Harrison Foundation, its first act being to create a full college scholarship fund for the children of all long-term employees. He personally delivered the first 2 scholarship certificates to Eleanor for Jacob and Sarah, seeing in their grandmother's tearful eyes a validation far greater than any stock market rally. He was on the factory floor every day, not as a CEO making an appearance, but as a partner. He learned the names of the workers, the stories of their families, and the rhythms of their lives. He discovered that the legacy his father left him wasn't a portfolio of assets, but a family of people waiting for him to come home. 2 years later, the Harrison Foods processing plant was almost unrecognizable. The air still smelled of disinfectant, but it was now mixed with the sounds of easy laughter and conversation that flowed over the hum of the machinery. The harsh lights seemed softer, or perhaps it was just the warmth emanating from the people below. Caleb, dressed in a simple work shirt with the sleeves rolled up, sat at a table in the bustling cafeteria, listening intently as a young line worker recounted his son's first Little League home run. He was no longer an outsider playing a role. He was simply a part of the fabric of the place. Eleanor, now officially retired from the line, but never from her purpose, moved through the plant like a beloved matriarch, offering a word of encouragement here, a piece of advice there, her quiet strength, the undisputed heartbeat of the company. On a bright Monday morning, a nervous young woman stood at the entrance, clutching her new employee orientation packet. She looked overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the facility, a deer in the headlights of a new life. Just then, Eleanor approached, her face crinkling into a warm, reassuring smile. She gently took one of the woman's hands in her own calloused ones, a gesture of immediate acceptance. "Don't you worry," Eleanor said, her voice kind. "You'll do just fine here." She then led her through the doors, past the gleaming machinery and the focused workers, and with a sense of profound, hard-won pride, she spoke the words that had finally become true once more. "Welcome to the Harrison family." Stories like this remind us that a single act of courage can restore dignity to many. If you believe in the power of these transformations, please subscribe, as it helps us continue to share them with the world.